Today I wanted to take you through a brief tour of what it is to make paint and how you can go about making paint. Now there'll be a lot of things that are going on as this video goes ahead. I'm commentating on this after the fact, so don't be alarmed if I'm not covering what's going on exactly as you're seeing it at the moment. But in effect, what you'll see is that I'm working on a glass slab, and that glass slab is frosted in some way, might be sandblasted. I've ground this particular slab so it's quite fine with carborundrum. I prefer that over sandblasted surfaces. I just prefer the way it handles and grinds the paint. The tool that I'm using to grind the paint is a muller, and that's a glass muller, and this will let me in effect distribute the oil in the paint. We'll end up with some very nice paint. Now traditionally, the real traditional way would be to use a stone slab and usually perhaps porphyry, and also your muller would be a stone as well. But I've got my station set up to grind on a glass slab and a glass muller. That's more common nowadays if you were to make your own paint. What you can see as we're going through the process is that I'm adding pigment and oil together, and I'm working in a figure of 8 motion. And what that does is if you're mixing the pigment and the oil, the linseed oil in this case, together, you might get a material that appears to be paint-like if you use a particular, if you use more linseed oil to pigment, but actually all you're making is a very loose paste, and the oil won't be quite distributed well enough to form a good quality paint. So really the tool that I'm using, the muller, the glass muller, is there to enable you to use sheer force against the pigment and the oil against the glass slab to distribute each particle and oil so that they're nicely combined, so that you end up with a very high quality paint. What you may have noticed is that I am making what we would term as a paste. So it's where the oil and the pigment is loosely bound. It seems quite stiff, and on first appearance you may think that you won't be able to add any more pigment in, but as we go through this video you'll see that every time I grind, the paint will start to give a bit more and it'll become more fluid and more flexible. And at that point what I can then do is introduce more pigment into the paste mixture. So you can see that I've just brought together some more paste. I'm grinding that paste, and as I scrape this away it will become more fluid. And the aim really is to end up with a paint that you enjoy working with. There are loads of different kinds of ways that you can go about making your own paint in terms of viscosity and texture and what the paint does. And for me, my personal preference is to have a very stiff paint, a paint that is really, it doesn't yield easily, and that you can get some beautiful, really raw brush marks with, and it's really tough to work with. I enjoy that. Not everyone enjoys that, but for me, I like a very dense paint. So here you might start noticing that as we go along, the paint seems to become much stiffer, and in fact you can see that as I'm trying to lift the glass muller up, it's becoming a bit more resistant to me actually lifting it up, and it might just start to become slightly more difficult to grind. But as you notice, as we go through the process, it'll give again and it'll become more fluid. And there I'm testing the paint to see whether it's meeting the typical sort of consistency that I want. Now, in general, regardless of how I grind my paint, what you want in a good handmade paint is that when you test it with a palette knife, that it doesn't slump and it doesn't slouch, and it's not going all over your palette or your glass slab, but rather it's holding a form, and that you're actually able to make slight peaks with it when you lift your palette knife up. And it can take some getting used to. Sometimes you think you've got it, particularly if you're working over across a range of different pigments. But what I would say is there's a fine line between a paint that's underbound and a paint that's just bound enough. You can often tell when you're lifting your palette knife up, you will find that you might start to get peaks, but you'll also get a jaggedness in the way that the paint breaks when you lift it up. And that to me would say that the paint would either need more grinding or that a tiny bit more oil might be needing to be introduced. And you can see here that the paint is becoming incredibly stiff to work with. I'm working it in a much more intense way now. But notice also that the paint seems to have much more body. Now, paint it can become a very personal thing. And often you'll probably know if you paint in or have painted for a number of years, you'll probably have a manufacturer that you enjoy working with, because some paints are stiff, some paints are loose, some paints can be a bit more stringy or long, other paints are a bit more short, and that can affect the way the paint reacts on the surface, whatever surface you're working with. And that can change things drastically for you. Now, if you're thinking, well, why might I want to make my own paint? It's because you then have that control. You have control over what your paint is doing. And there are things that will be available to you when you're making your own paint that you just can't get out of commercial paint. So the stiffness that I really like in paint is not something you'll generally see in most modern manufacturers, or certainly not to the extent with which I enjoy anyway. So for me, the big reason I started making paint was because I wanted a paint that would handle like lead, which is not available in the UK anymore, which is where I'm based. And I tried the commercial alternatives, and it didn't really handle as you would expect a lead-based paint to handle. So in the end, I actually developed my own substitute, which I offer. So if you're interested in that, you can check out the links in my bio. So really, it was a rabbit hole I went down through necessity for what I wanted to do with my work. But it can be a very rewarding experience in your own practice. if you're really curious about the materials. And actually, it's a very nice way to reconnect with the history of painting, which I'm always very keen on, because before around 18, well, the middle of the 19th century, so 1850, 1840, that kind of period, you had a number of changes where aluminium tubes, the collapsible tubes that we take for granted today, they were invented, they were brought to the market, and that meant that loads of different things, different options, were available to artists, different colours that you could then store. You weren't able to easily store colours before collapsible tubes. There were ways to, I mean, you had bladders, pig's bladders that you could store paint in, but the paint didn't keep in that for very long, and so it wasn't ideal. What you would often find is that artists would actually grind their own paint as and when they needed to their own specifications. And so that often in older paintings you will see things which you might not have an idea of how they did, right? How they did that. You may not have an idea of how they did that, but often that is either through things that they've added to the paint, or the way they've ground the paint, the pigments they've used. And it's worth remembering as well, even with impressionist ways of working, the tubes were really well established by then. The impressionists were able to work in ways that really it wasn't possible before. But even with paint manufacturing as it was then, things have changed now, so that you'll get manufacturers that won't be using materials that older methods of manufacturing would use. If you begin to talk about fillers, stabilisers, extenders, all the things that were seen as perhaps bad in earlier tubed paints, or things that were built on to make a cheaper paint, perhaps an artist's grade paint to be transformed into a student grade paint. Often fillers, stabilisers and extenders get a bad name. However, in the history of painting, those kinds of materials you would see regularly appearing in, say, Rembrandt paintings, Velasquez paintings, their studios, their workshops, as a way to change the properties of paint. So marble dust, calcium carbonate, these things, if you add, and you knowingly add them, will change the properties of paint in a positive way if you're working. It's when these things are added in excess that you end up with a degradation of paint, and you get a kind of reputation for why fillers and extenders are seen as a bad thing today, but they're not always a bad thing. Now, just going back to the what you're seeing on screen, we're coming towards the end of the process now. And for context, this would have taken me, well, it did take me around about an hour and a half to grind this much paint. It is a very laborious process. Because I grind my paint stiff, it does take a while. You can grind a loose paint and it won't take this long. But I like a very heavy bodied paint, because that's just my preference for working. But you can see that resistance now, and you can also see, if you look carefully, a slight flexibility in the paint, a slight elasticity, and the peaks will become exaggerated. There's your paint. It's got a beautiful sheen to it. It breaks nicely. So really, if you're interested in making your own paint, give it a go. It's worthwhile. It's a lot of fun. It's very rewarding.